It's been an amazing journey, this life of mine. This planet has filled me with the wonder of all living things, great and small. We cannot ignore this earth that surrounds us, that feeds us, shelters us, replenishes our bodies and our souls, and stretches our imaginations, where animals, plants, air, water, all care for us. We're all interconnected. People, animals, our environment. When nature suffers, we suffer. And when nature flourishes, we all flourish. I do believe in the possibility of a world where we can live in harmony with nature, but only if every one of us does our part to make that world a reality. So that when you look back over your journey, your life, you can truly say, I did make a difference.
Wow, what a wonderful welcome. Thank you. And so I think you deserve a good greeting too, that you'd hear if you came with me into one of the places in Africa where our closest living relatives still live, which is me, Jane, in chimpanzee language. So I want to kind of go back in time to try and help us to understand how I come to be who I am today. And I was born before World War II, 1934, in actually in London. And I was born loving animals. People say, well, Jane, you know, what triggered your love of animals? I don't know. I popped out into the world loving animals. And I was blessed with having a wonderful mother. And I'm telling this story on purpose because having supportive parents, I think, is one of the most amazing starts in life that anyone can have. My father was out of the picture because he joined up as soon as the war began. So was my mother. And she supported this love of animals. So one of my favorite stories is when I was 4 years old. We were living in London at the time. And Mum took me for a holiday on a farm in the country, a proper farm where animals moved around in the fields. And I was so excited, I can still remember it. And I was given a job to help collect the hens' eggs. And the hens pecked around in the farmyard. And then there were, I think, about 6 little hen houses where they slept at night. And around the edge were little boxes with lids where they were supposed to lay their eggs. So my job was to collect the eggs. And I went around with my little basket. And apparently, I don't remember this, but I was saying, but where is the hole on the hen big enough for the egg to come out? Nobody told me. I remember vividly seeing this hen. She was brown, and she walked into a hen house, and it was about, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So I thought, she's going to lay an egg, and crawled after her. Big mistake, squawks of fear, she flew out. And in that little 4-year-old brain, I must have realized no hen will lay an egg in this hen house. It's a dangerous place. There's something horrible in there. So I went into an empty hen house and waited. And I apparently waited 4 hours. Nobody knew where I was. Everybody was searching. And then my mother, who was just about to call the police, sees this little girl covered in straw running towards the house. And how many mothers would have grabbed that child and said, where have you been? How dare you go off without telling us? Don't you know how worried we've been? But my mother saw my shining eyes and sat down to hear the wonderful story of how a hen lays an egg. And I can still close my eyes and see that hen coming in. And she settled down on a little straw nest and slightly raised her legs, and I actually saw the egg coming out. And I don't know who was more excited, me or the Or the hen. Buck, 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 buck. Buck. Anyway, so the reason I love that story is that is the making of a little scientist. Curiosity, asking questions, not getting the answer you want, deciding to find out for yourself, and not giving up, learning patience. A different kind of mother might have crushed that early curiosity, and I might not have done what I've done. So when I was growing up, as I say, it was just before World War II. So by the time I was 5, Britain was at war with Germany, and most of Europe had been crushed. And so there was no television when I was growing up. So how did I learn about animals that I loved so much? I learned from books. And there weren't any children's books being sold in the shops during the war, but there was a little second-hand bookshop, and I loved it, and I used to spend my Saturday afternoons there. And the books were all piled higgledy-piggledy, and the little old man running it had no idea where anything was, but he didn't mind me going in there. And so when I was 10 years old, I had just saved enough of my penny pocket money per week to buy this little tiny second-hand book. It was about this big, very cheap edition, and it was called Tarzan of the Apes. So I bought it, I took it home, I climbed it up my favorite tree in the garden, read it from cover to cover, and you know, little girls of 10, and there are some here, I think, can be very romantic. I fell passionately in love with this glorious lord of the jungle. And what did Tarzan do? He married the wrong Jane. So I was very jealous. Of course, I knew there wasn't a Tarzan, but that began my dream. I will grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals, and write books about them. Well, in those days, girls simply didn't do that sort of thing. And everybody laughed at me. Jane, dream about something you can achieve. Africa's far away. We don't know much about it. It's full of cannibals and wild animals. And you don't have money, and you're just a girl. But not my mother. She just said to me, Jane, if you really want to do something like this, you're going to have to work really hard, take advantage of every opportunity, and if you don't give up, hopefully you find a way. And that's the message I've taken around the world, particularly to people in disadvantaged communities. And I just wish Mum was alive to know how many people have said, Jane, thank you. You taught me because you did it. I can do it too. So, at any rate, to cut the long story short, I couldn't go to university. We didn't have enough money. All my friends did. And I had to get a job. I learned how to be a secretary, terribly boring, but, you know, worked in London, and then came the opportunity, a letter from a school friend whose parents had moved to Kenya and bought a farm. And I was invited for a holiday. Yes, that was it. I couldn't save money in London. Went home and worked as a waitress in a hotel around the corner for about, 5 or 6 months. Finally had enough money. There were some planes flying in those days, but they weren't tourist planes like today. They were very expensive. So the normal way of traveling was by boat. The boat journey, which is incredibly exciting, with the cold grey waters of the UK, gradually getting warmer and bluer, and seeing my first flying fish, and then dolphins jumping around the boat. We should have gone through the Suez Canal, if you know your geography, and landed in Mombasa, Kenya, in about 2 weeks. But there was a war between Britain and Egypt, a very silly short war, but the Suez Canal was closed. So the boat had to go all the way around Cape Town and up the east coast of Africa. It was a magic journey. And the first place we set foot on African soil was Cape Town. And it was so exciting. I'm in Africa. I've actually made it. And there were Africans dressed in their native costume, and it was all new and exciting. And my mother had 2 friends there, and they said, we look after Jane for the 2 days the ship is in dock. And they took me around, and it was magic. But then I started to notice on the back of the seats on the doors into the hotels and the restaurants, there were these words in Afrikaans, sex blanc. I said, what do these words mean? White people only. It was the height of apartheid in South Africa, and I wasn't brought up that way. My grandfather was a congregational minister. We didn't judge people by the color of their skin, their culture. We judged people for who they actually were. So I couldn't wait to leave Cape Town. And when finally I got to Nairobi in Kenya, it was different because it was just on the verge of independence from British colonial rule. And so the atmosphere was totally, totally different. I stayed with my friend for a while. Then somebody said to me, Jane, I know you're interested in animals. You ought to meet Dr. Louis Leakey, famous paleontologist, anthropologist. He ran the Natural History Museum in Nairobi. So I made an appointment and I went to see him. And he took me all around the museum. He asked me millions of questions. And at the end of it, he offered me a job as his personal secretary. Guess what? 2 weeks before I appeared, his own secretary had suddenly quit. He needed a secretary. And there I was. That boring old secretarial course. You never know when something may be useful later on. And so I was surrounded now by people who could answer all my questions about the mammals and the birds and the reptiles, the insects, plants in Africa, in East Africa. And it was a dream come true. And then for 3 months in the summer, he let me and one other young English girl go with him and his wife to their 3-month dig in the now famous Olduvai Gorge. But in those days, nobody went there. There wasn't even a trail leading to it. And so we had to stand up in the old Land Rover and look for faint tracks in the grass showing where the car had been the year before. And Olduvai Gorge was surrounded by animals. There were elephants and giraffe, there were lions, there were leopards, there was everything. And Gillian and I shared a little tent, and it was a really magic experience. And I think it was because Leakey liked the way I behaved when on one night Gillian and I met a rhino as close as this wall. Luckily they don't see very well, and the wind was blowing from him to us. He trotted back and forth and then finally trotted in the other direction. Another evening was a young 2-year-old male lion, fully grown, with a bit of mane starting on his shoulders. He was curious, he followed us for a while. And so around the campfire that night, I think was the day that Leakey decided I was a person he'd been looking for, he says, for 10 years, who would go and study our closest living relative in the wild, the chimpanzee. So nobody had accomplished that. A couple of people had tried and given up. And Leakey wanted me to study the chimpanzees in what is now Tanzania, in what is now the Gombe National Park. It took a year before he could get the money. Second problem, the British authorities, it was just their colonial rule was about ending, but they were still there and they would not allow a young girl on her own into the forest. Ridiculous. Such things shouldn't be. But in the end, they gave in and said, okay, but she can't come alone. So who came with me? That same amazing mother. We arrived on the 14th of July, 1960. And we were greeted by a very stately African, dressed amazingly in his white robes, but also a woman's red winter coat and a red turban on his head. We learned later he was the most infamous witch doctor the area had ever known. We didn't know that at the time. And apparently, and I learned later from some of the staff, he told everybody that me and my mother were special and that they should look after us, and he told the animals as well not to hurt me. That's how it all began. So there we were, Mum and me. We had one second-hand army tent. And this was my dream come true. So every morning I was up at 5:30, had my little piece of toast, and set off into the mountains for the day. And people say, "Oh, Jane, you were so brave." I wasn't brave. I was following my dream. It was my mother who was brave. She was left in the camp. And it was the old ex-army tent. It didn't have nice sewn-in ground sheet and mosquito-proof windows. So if you wanted the air to come in, you rolled up the side flaps and tied them with tape. And in came the air, the scorpions, the spiders, the snakes, which I didn't particularly mind, but poor Mum. And there were buffalo, which sometimes came more or less through the camp, and baboons, which are very opportunistic, and they quickly smelt human food, which they decided was quite delicious. So they raided the camp, and the males have these great big canine teeth. And also we had been told we had to have a cook. So we had a cook who'd worked for all the families in the nearby town of Kigoma. And he was a brilliant cook, but he had a predilection for cooking sherry. And so he got fired by one family after another. And they decided, well, this is perfect. Jane and her mother won't have alcohol at Gombe, and they'll have a wonderful cook. Well, fine, except that it took 2 weeks for him to find an extremely alcoholic brew made of fermented bananas. And so there's Mum left with scorpions, spiders, and snakes, ravaging baboons, nearby buffalo, the most dangerous animal in Africa, people say, and a slightly inebriated cook. Nevertheless, for the first 4 months, which was the only time she could stay with me, she boosted my morale. But all those 4 months, the chimpanzees would take one look at me and vanish into the forest. They'd never seen anything like me before. And I was getting more and more despondent. I only had money for 6 months, and the weeks turned into months, and I was getting desperate. And it was Mum boosting my morale, saying, "Jane, you've got this peak, and through your binoculars, you're learning about how the chimps move around, either by themselves or small groups of males, or little groups of mothers and their offspring. Sometimes they gather together when there's a new food available with lots of excitement and charging around and play. You're learning how they make a nest at night, bending the branches over. You're learning a lot more than you think." And it was just really sad. She left only 2 weeks before the breakthrough observation, when I saw a chimpanzee, the one who had begun to lose his fear of me. I named him David Greybeard. He had this lovely white hair on his chin. And I saw him reach out a black hand, break off a grass stem, carefully push it down into a hole in a termite mound, carefully withdraw it, and eat off the termites. I saw him, moreover, pick leafy twigs, and to make those into tools, he had to remove the leaves very carefully. David Greybeard was using and making tools. So if you saw that today, it wouldn't be at all exciting. Many animals use tools, and some make them. Back then, science thought humans and only humans use and make tools. We were actually defined as man, the tool maker. And so when news of this broke out into the world, the National Geographic got interested and said that they would continue to support the research when my 6 months' money ran out. So now, finally, I could relax. And I gradually got to learn the different chimpanzees who are part of this community of about 50. Males are dominant, and males patrol the boundary of their territory. And so I began learning about their different personalities. They're as different as we are. And I began to learn about their behavior. And the most surprising thing is how like us they are. So, first of all, I was fascinated to find that their communication postures and gestures were the same as ours. Kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting one another, begging for food. Males competing for dominance, standing upright, swaggering with all their hair erect, making a furious bunched lips, and swaggering at each other, sometimes raising an arm. Doesn't that remind you of some human politicians? No name. I especially loved watching mothers and their infants. The chimp child has a very long childhood, 5 whole years, when they ride on the mother's first on the ventral side, then on her back. 5 years when they suckle, gradually less frequently, and gradually the mother pushes them to independence. So why this long childhood? Because the chimp child, like our children, need to learn a lot. And they learn by observing and imitating the behavior of the adults. And it was also fascinating to learn the first mother doesn't have her baby until she's about 12, 13 years old. And she then only has one child every 5 years. So chimpanzees, unlike humans, are not overpopulating their environment. They're living in harmony with it. And to my horror, I found that, like us, chimpanzees have a dark and brutal side to their nature. They're capable of war, the males patrolling their territory. If they see an individual from a neighboring community, they will give chase, and if they catch that unfortunate individual, it's usually a female, they attack so severely that individual is most likely to die. But although they have this dark side, just like us, they also, just like us, have a loving and altruistic side. True altruism, as when there was one young male, 8 years old, 12 years old, an adolescent, and a little infant of 3, just about able to live without the mother's milk at 3. And she died, and this little infant was left alone. If he'd had an older brother or sister, he would automatically have been adopted and cared for, but he didn't. And this young 12-year-old male adopted him, let him ride about on his back, cling to his belly if it was raining. He allowed the infant to sleep with him at night. He shared food with him, and he even went to rescue the child if he got in the way of males when they were excited and displaying. When a male will, it's like they're seeing red, and if an infant gets in the way, that infant is likely to be grabbed and dragged or thrown, as though it's a rock or a branch. And the mother's job is to take the infant out of the way. Spindle took on that job too, and often got beaten up. And he saved Mel's life. And there are many examples like that. So I've been with the chimpanzees about 2 years, got to know all these amazing individuals. I get a letter from my mentor, Louis Leakey, and he said, "Jane, I now need you to get a degree. I want scientists to take you seriously. And we haven't got time for a BA, so you have to go straight for a PhD, and I've got you a place in Cambridge University in the UK. It was the top scientific university at the time. So I'm nervous, imagine, I get there, and think what I felt like when I was told by so many of these erudite professors that I'd done everything wrong. You shouldn't name your subjects, you should not give them numbers. That's science. You can't talk about their personalities, their minds capable of solving problems. You certainly can't talk about their emotions. Why? Those are unique to humans. Well, fortunately, when I was a child, I had a wonderful teacher, and he had taught me that in this respect, these erudite professors were absolutely, totally, completely wrong. And that teacher was my dog, Rusty. So I'm sure many of you have a cat, dog, horse, whatever animal it is. And you know that we are not the only beings on this planet with personalities, minds, and emotions. And in fact now, science gradually has come to admit that animals like us are sentient beings. And there's a great interest in studying animal intelligence. It's not just chimpanzees and other apes and monkeys, and the dolphins and the whales and the elephants. But then we used to talk about a bird brain, meaning somebody who's clueless. That we now know that crows can solve some problems faster than an 8-year-old human child. And there's a huge interest in studying crows and magpies and other birds. So we don't talk about the bird brain anymore except with reverence. And some of you must have seen My Octopus Teacher, and if you haven't, please do. And so octopuses are like meeting an alien. They have one brain in the middle of the head, and that's why I carry Octavia with me. Octavia the octopus. She has one brain here, and then she has brains in every one of her 8 arms. And she can do things which nobody could have dreamed an octopus could do. They're unbelievably intelligent. And then rats, and you can Google 5 smart rats. Please ignore 5 ways to kill smart rats and look for. And rats can be trained to do, you know, those agility tests dogs have to do sometimes, where they run up ladders and down ladders and through hoops and that. Rats can do that. And it turns out that rats are amazingly intelligent. And this is a giant forest rat. They have been trained to detect the underground smell of the explosive used in landmines. So in Africa, where landmines are left as a horrible reminder of the long civil wars in some countries, these rats are detecting the landmines. They make a little scratch on the ground, and then the mine can be detonated. And I've watched them being trained and cuddled them and held them, and they're wonderful. So to go back now to where I left off, I'm at Cambridge. I finally get my degree anyway. I go back to Gombe. I build up a little tiny research station with just a few students. That research station has expanded now. It's in its 63rd year, the longest consecutive study of any wild animal in the world, except possibly the Japanese macaque. And those were the best days of my whole life. I could be out in the rainforest, and I could spend time alone, either with or without the chimps, and I felt this strong spiritual connection with the natural world. And I came to understand the ecosystem of the forest, made up of this complex mix of plant and animal species, each one with a role to play, no matter how tiny it was. And if you think of this as like a beautiful tapestry, a living tapestry, and every time an animal species or a plant species disappears from that particular ecosystem, it's a thread pulled from the tapestry. So if enough threads are pulled, the tapestry will hang in tatters and the ecosystem will collapse. And that's happening. And we are part of the natural world, and we depend upon it for food, clothing, air, water, everything. But we depend on healthy ecosystems, and those are disappearing around the world. So anyway, I'm now back in Gombe, having my happiest days, also learning about ecosystems, and continuing, of course, to learn about chimpanzees, and getting information from the other study sites that had by then been set up. This is 1986, and realizing that there are these different chimpanzee cultures in different parts of Africa, different objects used as different tools, different gestures used in different ways. And why did I leave that magical world of discovery and immersion in nature? Because in 1986, at a big conference that I helped to organize, we had one session. It was just about chimp researchers coming together to learn about different chimp cultures and so on. but we had a session on conservation. It was shocking. Everywhere. Forests were being destroyed. Chimp numbers were dropping. We had a session on conditions in some captive situations. The worst secretly filmed footage of our closest relatives in medical research laboratories in 5-foot by 5-foot cages, bars all around, bars on top, bars underneath. Nothing to do. And I went to that conference, which was 4 days, as a scientist, and I left as an activist. People say, that must have been a tough decision. I didn't decide, it was like, if you know the story of Paul on the road to Damascus, he started out as a persecutor of the early Christians. He ended up as the strongest of them all. So, what was I going to do? I just knew I had to do something to help. I didn't know what to do. I managed to get permission to go in some of the laboratories, because I think if you haven't seen with your own eyes, then you can't really talk about it from your heart. And amazingly, they let me in, and it started a long fight. And luckily, many animal welfare, animal rights groups joined in. And today, I'm happy to say, I don't think anywhere in the world is a chimpanzee in any kind of invasive medical research. They're mostly in sanctuaries. But then we come to Africa. So I got some money together, not very much, and I went to the other research sites, which by then had opened up, to try and learn more. And of course the main problem was deforestation. But there were other problems too. There was the bushmeat trade, that's the commercial hunting of wild animals for food. And then chimpanzees were being caught in the wire snares set by hunters for antelopes, bush pigs, and so on. And although they could break the wire, they couldn't get it off their wrist or their ankle. And so they very often lost a hand or a foot and sometimes died of gangrene. And then there was the animal trafficking. Mothers shot to steal the babies, to sell them for pets, circuses, and in those days, that's 86, back then, for medical research. And while I was learning about these problems facing the chimps, I was also learning about the problems faced by so many African people. I was learning about the crippling poverty, the lack of good health and education facilities, the degradation of the land, the need to move further into the wild places in order to get more land to grow more food. It came to a head when I flew over the Gombe National Park, where our study is still going on. It's the smallest national park in Tanzania, and when I arrived in 1960, it was part of the great equatorial forest belt that stretched across Africa, right the way from the middle of Africa to the west coast. By the late 1980s, when I flew over in a small plane, I was horrified to see a little island of forest that was Gombe National Park, and all around were bare hills. It was obvious that there were more people living there than the land could support, and they were cutting down the trees in order to make more land to grow more food, or to make money from charcoal or timber. Too poor to buy food from elsewhere. And that's when it hit me. If we can't help these people find ways of making a living without destroying their environment, we can't save chimps, forests, or anything else. And so the Jane Goodall Institute, we started trying to get money for a community-led conservation program. We started to try and get the money in about 1986, I think. But it took a while because it was new back then. And the first grant we got was from the European Union for 3 years. And it started off not with a group of arrogant white people going into a poor African village and telling them, well, we're going to help you improve your lives. No, no, no. It was a carefully chosen team of 7 local Tanzanians. And they went into the villages and sat down with the elders and said, what do you think we can do to help make your lives better? The first things they wanted was to grow more food, and they wanted better education for their children and better health facilities. So that's where we began. And then, as people came to trust us, we were able to start other projects with the cooperation of the people in the villages. First of all, scholarships to give girls a chance of secondary education. They didn't have it back then. And we began water management programs. We began microcredit facilities based on Muhammad Yunus's Grameen Bank, so that the villagers could start their own small, environmentally friendly businesses and gradually rise up out of poverty. And we also provided family planning. When I first got to Gombe, the average number of children per woman, and a man had 4 wives, the average number was 8 to 10. And of course, many of them died because the healthcare was more or less non-existent. But gradually the people came to understand that they can't afford to educate 8 to 10 children. They understand that children having a good education is a way out of poverty. And so they accepted family planning with great joy. We didn't take it around the villages. 12 villages around Gombe is how it started. It was the local people. We gave them education, and it was they who went into the villages. Not only women, but men too. And this was so successful that today it's in 104 villages throughout Chimp Range in Tanzania. We've introduced GIS, GPS, satellite imagery, trained people from the villages to become forest monitors. They're very proud. They have their little smartphones or iTablets, and they go into the forest, and they chose what to write down. A tree that's been illegally cut, an illegal animal trap, a dropped bullet, but also on the other side, we've seen chimpanzees, we've seen a leopard, whatever. And they're very proud of this work. And then they upload it into the clouds, and it's there for everyone to see. That program is so successful that the people understand protecting the environment isn't just for wildlife, it's for their own future. It's now in 6 other African countries where JGI studies chimpanzees. And I can proudly say there are chimpanzees alive and forests growing. They wouldn't be there if this hadn't happened. So, while we actually have just produced a book called Local Voices, Local Choices, which is an eyewitness account for many of the people who've benefited from this. Well, by this time I'm traveling around the world and giving lectures and trying to raise awareness, and on the side trying to raise money. I don't like that part of it, but we do need money to keep these things going. And so this program, as it grew, was costing more money. And it hit me. If we don't have young generation growing up to understand the importance of caring for the environment, all the work we're doing today is useless. And so this program, Roots and Shoots, which was mentioned in the introduction, began in 1991. And it began when 12 high school students from 8 different high schools in Dar es Salaam, where I had a house by then, they came to me, and they were concerned about so many different things. Some of them worried about illegal dynamite fishing, destroying the coral reefs. Some of them were worried about the poaching in the national parks. Why wasn't the government doing more about it? It was a very corrupt government back then, by the way. Some of them worried about the street children with no homes, sniffing glue in the streets. Some of them were concerned about people throwing stones at stray dogs. They wanted me to do something about it. And I said, well, go and get your friends together and we'll have a meeting. So a meeting of about 30 young people. They were all aged 17, 19, and something like that. And that's when Roots and Shoots was born, with the main message: every single one of us makes an impact on the planet every single day. And like everybody in this room, we have a choice what sort of impact we make. And we decided that because I'd learned in the rainforest how everything is interconnected, every group of Roots and Shoots would choose, in other words, bottom up, not top down, that young people would choose 3 projects: one to help people, one to help animals, one to help the environment. And out of this initial 12 young people, this program is now in almost 70 countries. Most of my lectures that I give talk about hope. And in these very dark times, sometimes it's hard to have hope. And people are always asking me, Jane, do you really have hope? And I've got several reasons for hope. And there is hope, but there's a big but. There's a window of time when, if we get together and take action to slow down climate change, slow down loss of biodiversity, to get rid of industrial agriculture, especially the agriculture of farmed animals in these factory farms, when we start to think about the impact on the environment and on individuals of genetically modified foods and animals. All these problems and many others, the chemical pesticides and herbicides that are killing the soil on which we all depend. The effects of climate change we see all around the world, with increased changes in weather patterns, worse and more frequent hurricanes and storms, and flooding and droughts, and the terrible fires that we hear about all over the world today. Climate change is real. Animal species were in the midst of the 6th great extinction, the first extinction caused by human activities. And many people are giving up. It's not surprising. I mean, if you look around the world today with the wars, the conflicts, the destruction of the environment, I defy any one of you not to feel depressed. That's why many people feel depressed. They feel, what can I do? The problems are so huge. The answer is, you cannot save the world, but you can do something in your own community. What do you care about? Do you care about plastic that's polluting the ocean? Do you care about the factory farming that is of animals that is causing huge destruction of the environment for miles around, to grow the food to feed all these billions of prisoners in the factory farms, all of which produce methane gas, which is a very virulent greenhouse gas. It's more virulent than CO2 that comes from the emissions from use of fossil fuel. Luckily, it's not as prevalent. And also in the factory farms, the animals, just to keep them alive, are given antibiotics, so the bacteria are becoming more and more resistant to every form of antibiotic, and that's leading to the superbugs that are the bane of hospitals around the world. So we are living through dark times, and it's not surprising that people have lost hope. And that's why I say to them, think about something you care about in your community, reach out to friends, see what you can do. Realize that by working on a project, you can make a difference. And that's why I have so much hope in the young people, the Roots and Shoots members, but also other organizations, because once they start to understand the problems and we empower them to take action and we give them a voice, we give them a choice, they can choose what they're passionate about. So they roll up their sleeves and they take action. And I'm telling you, there are places around the world today with all our time zones where there are young people planting trees, volunteering in shelters, volunteering in soup kitchens. You name it, they do it. And they are making this world a better place. And it's my greatest reason for hope is the young people Why are we growing so fast? We partner with other organizations. And we don't take them over. But if we partner with, I don't remember the name of the organization that exists here for young people, but if we partner, then the young people here will be part of a global family, which Roots and Shoots is. And we can take the voices of the local people out into this great wide network that we have built around the world. So that's why we're growing. And so my last reason for hope is what I call the indomitable spirit, the people out there who tackle problems that seem impossible to solve, but they pay no attention when people tell them, you're being silly, you can't solve this. They just carry on and so often succeed. And these are icons like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and so on. But they're just ordinary people who have terrible problems to overcome in their own personal lives, in their own cities, their own towns, their own villages. And they just don't give up. And I've got so many stories, but we don't have time for them. I bring Mr. H with me because, I forgot poor old Cow. I think I'd better do Cow first. Cow is one of the people I carry around with me to represent the factory-farmed cows. And if you've seen any of the secretly filmed footage of how cows are treated in these factory farms, it makes you, I don't know what it makes you, but I couldn't sleep at night. And so cow represents what's happening. And I always say to the children, one of the problems with cows, food goes in here. They're ruminants, they have 4 stomachs, so some of the gas created by their food comes out with belches, and the rest of it comes out the other end. And that's the methane gas I was talking about. But I've actually come to Mr. H. Mr. H was given to me about 32 years ago on my birthday. And he was given to me by a man who thought he was giving me a stuffed chimpanzee. And I reached out for his hand and I said, Gary, chimps don't have tails. Gary Horn is blind. Horn, Mr. H. And he said, well, never mind, take him where you go and my spirit's with you. So Mr. H has been with me for 62 or even 3 countries around the world. But the great thing about Gary Horn, he went blind when he was 21. He was in the US Marines. And when he's learning how to live in this new black world, he decides for some extraordinary reason to become a magician. And everybody says, but Gary, you can't be a magician if you're blind. And he says, well, I can try. He does shows for children. He arranges his props beforehand. And the children don't know he's blind. Most adults don't know he's blind. I was amazed when I saw his first magic act. And at the end of the show, he'll say to the children, he'll tell them that he's blind, and he'll say, things may go wrong in your life. We never know. But if they do, don't give up. There's always a way forward. And he does skydiving and all kinds of crazy things. But for me, the most magical one, he taught himself to paint. And in our office in DC, we have the original portrait of Mr. H, painted by a man who's never seen him, but only felt him. And it's completely amazing. And I just have to tell you about another great friend of mine from Canada called Chris Koch. And he was born with no arms, well, there were little tiny stumps about the size of my wrist, and no legs, but out of one hip came, it looks like a flipper. It may be a foot, I don't know what it is. And his parents treated him just like the other children in their family, and he learned to do everything for himself. And when you meet this man, no arms and no legs, and you know that he's been around the world alone on a skateboard, and when you go to sit down on the floor with him, he says, no, no, and he gives a sort of hop and is up on the sofa beside you. And you're looking straight into his eyes, and you're looking at someone with so much vitality, with so much love of life, with so much enthusiasm for making change. You're humbled. And it is a great reason for hope, these people out there doing amazing things, showing the strength of the human indomitable spirit. If we work with our head and our heart in harmony, because that's where we've gone wrong. We're making decisions not based on how will this harm the future, but how will it help me now, my next political campaign, how will it affect the shareholders? And it's because head and heart have moved away from harmony with each other. And I truly believe only when head and heart work in harmony can we attain our true human potential. And our true human potential with our brains and how we're moving towards a better world, seeking out new farming methods, finding ways of rewilding the planet, of bringing nature back to places where we had destroyed it, animals rescued from the brink of extinction, poverty gradually being impacted by efforts to raise people out of poverty, people beginning to think about their own environmental footprint. Go to bed, think to yourself, what have I done today? Have I made the world a little bit better, or didn't I care? And this is what's happening. Awareness is growing. People are changing. That is the greatest hope for the future.